Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I don't know where you're all at. I have a bias towards Pacific time, even though I live now on the East Coast. Bias. Bias is any trend or deviation in truth which causes false conclusions intentionally or unintentionally. We all deal with and work with bias every day. For example, I don't know if I'm on the East Coast or the West Coast. It's a small bias, but they're everywhere. A bias can be your friend. Bias makes decision making easier. Rather than having to think of everything from scratch, having a bias towards something helps you make that initial decision, and that can be a good thing. Your initial prediction, whether it's right or not, could be anchored. We'll talk about anchoring as well in what you need, what you know, or what you believe. And sometimes bias. There are a number of cases where bias has been shown to be better than data. Now, some of you are probably saying, "How could that be?" There's case studies where one that comes to mind is there was a CEO of a company, and he hired one of the big analyst firms, and they came in and they did all this work, and they came in and showed him why he shouldn't do a particular acquisition. Yeah, and all the data showed it was wrong. Well, this guy was from another country, and he had a feeling, a bias, that the currency changes would change the whole picture. So he turned down everybody's recommendations and just did it, and he was right. But in some cases, simple things, right? If you see a lion running after you, you're just talking about hiking in the woods before the thing started. Run. You don't need to think about it. Run. So that's where bias can be your friend. Having a problem here. Here we go. Bias is your foe. The impression that we see things the way they are and not filtered through our own expectations, preferences, or ideology is a real problem. When we look at something and say, gee, that's good or that's bad or that's right or that's wrong, without data, but just based on our experience, many times we're wrong. Even failing to recognize bias is a bias itself. Poor Adam, our VP of marketing, said, Dan, you need to use big fonts. I said, Adam, you got a big font bias. No, I did use big fonts, but he does have a big font bias. And bias gets us in trouble so often. I'm a big fan of the book by Kahneman. We'll talk about that in a minute. We all have biases. Sometimes we just go with them. What should we eat for dinner? I get a bias towards a particular restaurant. Sometimes it's difficult to say, what are my biases, to figure out what they are and then make decisions that are right and not just biased. For example, we've been working on this project for the last 3 years, and we're almost done. And I love this project. I've worked it for 3 years. Shouldn't kill it. We're almost there. Assuming everything's going to go right in planning, we'll talk about some of the work that's been done in those areas, biased towards success. The planning fallacy and reference class forecasting, which are things to help us identify and mitigate bias. But the planning fallacy says people are going to be biased even when they know they are. Now, I grew up in Chicago. I have never in my life had ketchup on a hot dog. The quote here is from a distant relative who owns a hot dog stand who says, no ketchup on hot dogs, it's a sin. I will never in my life have ketchup on a hot dog. My kids eat ketchup on a hot dog just kind of to taunt me. But I've got a bias towards ketchup. It might be good. I'm never going to find out. Cognitive bias is that this is things that we think of, a tendency to make decisions based on our perceptions rather than evidence. What do we think something is instead of what do we know what it is? Now we have to do this much of the time, but it gets us into a lot of trouble, a lot of ways. Some of the analysts said perception has more to do with our desires and how we want to view ourselves than reality. If I had my druthers, I'd be wearing size 32 pants, whether I could fit into it or not. They go back and study these things and they say, well, bias really has helped us in the past. Again, if we see a lion running after us, run. Different ways to survive and avoid irrational conclusions. And bias impacts everything from how we handle our money to relating to other people to how we form memories. Everything in our lives is based on bias. To remove all bias is probably impossible, but it's important to recognize biases in business decisions. Here's a few biases. On the upper right, anybody remember Digital Equipment Corporation? There's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. I love digital equipment back in the day, but they had a bias against the home computers. Bill Gates, 640K should be enough for anybody. We will never reach the moon, regardless of all scientific advances. My favorite one, any general who's worth his salt knows that war is not a Nintendo game. War is not something fought by robots. That was in 1991. So bias impacts us everywhere. Some of these biases get us in big trouble. Averages are part of the problem as well. When people take averages instead of looking at data, I see so often people take averages or percentages that it just gets them in trouble. This picture down here on the bottom is showing an analyst who's drowning in water that has an average depth of 6 inches. It's important to realize those kinds of biases as well. Now we can fix these things with risk analysis or Monte Carlo analysis, but adding distributions and probabilities to quote the number can really make a difference. There's numerous examples of this. Here's a couple. In North Dakota, they did an analysis and actually used averages and said, well, the river would crest at 49 feet. They made all their flood management plans on the 49 feet. Well, it crested at 50. Breach of dikes caused a flood that forced 50,000 people out of their homes, all because of simple averages and biases. In Orange County, California, they borrowed money at low interest rates, said, oh, this is a piece of cake, we're going to make a fortune. They left out the fact that there was a 5% probability of losing $1 billion+, which is what happened. Ended up in Orange County going bankrupt. Averages can get us in big trouble. I mean, these are all biases. Now, one of the ways to mitigate biases, the wrong assumptions are problematic, but at least when we know the assumptions, we can help and deal with them. So identify your assumptions. Mitigate bias, assumption bias where you can. Now, this is hard to do, but figure out the best you can where we might be biased. Flag those. Rank order the assumptions based on their probability that they're going to occur. Identify the high-ranking assumptions that are risky, the ones that are going to cost a lot of money that have the highest risk. Clarify those. We'll do more analyses on those. And then describe that in terms of uncertainty. So just writing down assumptions and so other people can see them can help you, can be a huge help in mitigating bias. There's so many different factors here. Anchoring. Anchoring is a cognitive bias where decisions are influenced by a reference point, by another number. This one here is an example. The Wheel of Fortune, if they spun the Wheel of Fortune, they had a subject come up and spin the Wheel of Fortune. Then they asked them the number of African countries in the United States. Is it greater or less than the number on the wheel? If they were asked the number of quick questions, if the number was higher, they guessed a higher number of countries. If the number is lower, they guessed a lower number of countries. Now you could say one's got nothing to do with the other. That's just the way human minds work. Look at another one. Relative comparisons. Which fish is bigger there? I hope we all know that the little pond with the big fish is bigger. But the way to help mitigate this is by comparison. Which fish is bigger? I can see that fish on the right is a lot bigger than that fish on the left. By doing comparisons, bigger, smaller kinds of comparisons, things like AHP and those kind of things, we can help mitigate bias. Now, this is interesting. Thinking Fast and Slow is much of the content in here comes from that book. I absolutely recommend that book. They found that the estimate tends to change by 55% of the change of the anchor. So if I said, hey, we need a project and I believe it'll be done in a year, you go to figure out how long it'll be. And my bias of a year will impact the people's actual analysis. This is one of the big risks in bias. If I change the anchor, then I'll get a different number. Here's an example. How happy are you? Study asked college students, how happy are you and how often are you dating? When they asked how happy are you first and then how often are you dating second, the answers virtually didn't correlate. Then they reversed it. How often are you dating? Then how happy are you? When they asked how often are you dating first, the two answers showed a much, much higher correlation. The dating question caused people to anchor on the happiness question. Now, this is a silly example, perhaps, but it happens every day in our work. Again, how long before you finish this project? How much is this going to cost? How long is this going to take? Where are we going to go from here? All these things often end up with anchors. Estimates comparison. Things like Galler's got a thing called estimate by comparison, but AHP, analytical hierarchy process, those things where you can do bigger, smaller relative analyses can really help. And they can generate a range of anything: cost, schedule, weight. When I was younger, I used to use, young I should say, I used to use estimate by comparison in training classes to have people guess somebody's age. And when I got older, I stopped doing that because it got ugly, but worked really well. If I knew if somebody's actual age, and we could estimate people that were relatively older or younger really well. Then after I stopped doing age, I did weight, and then I put on some weight, so I stopped that as well. But comparison analyses is a significant way to mitigate bias. Doug Hubbard is one of my other heroes. He has done some wonderful books, and this particular example here is a study that he did. He asked Harvard MBA's general trivia, and they got 40% correct. Their goal was to get 90%. Now, he asked the chemical company's employees general industry information. 50% of them were correct. He asked those employees about company-specific information. Only 48% were correct. And it goes on. By asking questions without having a plan to mitigate best cases, worst cases, and other things, you can end up with huge biases, and planning just on the most likely gets people in trouble all the time. Again, I'm a big fan of Daniel Kahneman, and I recommend his books constantly. And he's got an article in the Harvard Business Review based on the Nobel Prize winning phenomenon. He's won a Nobel Prize, an absolute genius. Here's what he found. Humans are hardwired to be optimists. It's built into us. We routinely exaggerate the benefits and discount the costs, and we don't mean to, even when we don't mean to. We use an inside view, meaning we look at only what we know from internally, and we end up making decisions from our own experience rather than looking outside. And bias permeates opinions and decisions and causes waste and failure everywhere. The planning fallacy. Again, this is by Kahneman and an associate. Judgment errors are systematic and predictable. They're not random. Even when people know that they're biased, they still are biased. Optimism is due to overconfidence and ignoring uncertainty. And the root cause of this problem is people look at every venture as new. They don't try to look at what we can learn from past experience. So again, judgment errors are systematic and predictable, not random. And people are going to be optimism biased even when they know they are. This is an interesting example from Europe. The Euro train, Eurorail, that goes underneath the channel and comes out, goes from England to France. They overran by about 100%. The benefits were about half what they thought they would be. And it cost them 17.8 billion pounds. The analysis they did was all biased. They performed a business case, but they didn't eliminate the over-optimism in costs and over-optimism in benefit. So a great example, but there's examples everywhere, every day. Reference class forecasting. Just take the outcomes of planned action and compare them to a reference class. Reference class is just actuals. So find data of other programs that might have been similar and use that rather than starting from scratch. Now, there aren't always similar programs, but often there are. If there aren't, you can use models here or other things like that as well, of course. Force that outside view by looking at other systems and what happened. Choose the relevant analogous projects. Again, in some cases, we don't have them. For example, the next shot to Mars, we probably don't have really good data for what it takes to go to Mars, for a man's trip to Mars. But if we do, to do the best we can probably use that data and at least get a bound. Compute a probability distribution from that information. Compare that to the range of your new projects and what you think and estimate in the new projects to the completed projects. That provides an outside view, not just looking at our own opinions, but things from outside. Again, you can use things like SEER or other things for that as well. but come up with an outside view. Why are things looking different than what we thought internally? Again, risk management is another way to help identify bias, but even risk management can be biased. At level one, try to come up with an unbiased opinions as you can. It's hard, writing them down, as I talked about earlier, can help. Having other people question them. Are you sure that it's really going to be able to get the stuff in time? We're redoing the roof on our house, and you wouldn't believe maybe you would believe the unbelievable biased estimates we're getting. And but there are ways to mitigate that. Benchmarking. Look to a viable database. We could go say, what did the last 5 people on the block have? What did their roofs cost? Level 3, diligence. Estimate the answer using, again, with rigor. Number 4, rigorous estimating. Parametric or relative analysis, reference class forecasting using actual data to forecast. And then at the level 5, risk management, including black swan management. Black Swan's one of my other favorite books. The things that could never happen that happened anyway, and looking at what those might be. Anyway, by looking at risk management, we can help mitigate bias. Again, our risk management might still be biased, but we can help. This is another experiment on anchoring. Here, they had 500 or so people from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, and they're mostly JPLers and some students. And they gave them a problem. He said, here, how long is it going to take? You had a party, and you got all these dishes, and they told what kind of things were on the dishes. And they said, here's what you need to clean. Exactly. You need to clean up 4 plates, 4 dessert plates, etc. So, they gave them the tools. You got a sponge, a dishwashing brush, and lots of hot water. How long? How long is it going to take? The numbers were all over the place. The nominal expected value was 30 minutes. 31 was the 50% probability, a little bit off of there. 27 was the best case by people's estimates. Their bias was so optimistic that anything this experiment did, made them even more optimistic. So again, a fair study, but people skewed towards optimism, as I guess we know people skew toward optimism everywhere. Here's an example. Here we've got number of person days. And if you look here, somebody went through and said step 1 is going to be 30 days, step 2 is going to be 50, etc. Add them all up, 500 days. Well, that's great, but how much bias is in them? By using a least likely and most, we can come up with a much better number. For example, here we have the same people provide the best case. Now, the way to provide best case versus expected case is not just take plus or minus 10%, which some people do. I think that's a big mistake. But to say for that particular item, what exactly really do we think the best case is? I've done this thousands of times with people. And people what I usually do is I ask for the best case first. And they usually give me a number that ends up being the likely case. And then they say, well, what if everything went right? And as they think about it, yeah, it's probably the best case. But by having a range of best case, likely case, worst case, we now can run a risk analysis. Remember, our original number was 500. The risk analysis, you virtually can't get that to happen. Most likely, that project's going to take 731 days. In worst case, 817 days. What if you just went with the single point estimate? Yeah, our plan is going to take 500 days. It'd be a total disaster, as so many things are. It's sometimes simple range analysis, simple mitigation techniques can help. Correlation bias. Just because there's a correlation doesn't mean there's a causation. This is one of my favorites. The graph on the right shows the correlation between the number of people who died being tangled in their bed sheets and the per capita consumption of cheese. The correlation coefficient is 0.94, almost perfect correlation. The number of people who died from becoming tangled in their bed sheets and the per capita consumption of cheese. How can that be? So often I see people using correlations that are just, there's no causation. They didn't make it happen. Understanding and digging in and figuring out, was it just correlation or was it actually causation, is a significant job that can help reduce bias. So bias is everywhere. Bias is our friend. It can be effective when the problem is well known. Bias can save your life. Run from that lion. Kelly's going off hiking in the mountains. Kelly, if you see a lion, run. Biases are foe. Even subject matter experts will still be wrong when they know that they're normally wrong. Cognitive bias causes planning failures, even when the bias is known. When I'm thinking wrong, I'll have failures, even when I know I'm thinking wrong. And you think, well, why don't we just fix it? It's hard for human beings to fix it. Anchoring. Anchoring is a problem of saying, okay, we know number one was X and number two is Y. And having the bigger or smaller number from number one will make me give a different answer myself. Loss aversion bias keeps us from walking away when the money's been spent. We spent so much on this project, it's 90% done. Let's keep on working on it. Optimism bias, it keeps us from understanding risks. I remember once in my career, I had run a software model to look at how long a project would take. And a proposer was in, and they had a number, I don't remember what it was 20% or something of the estimate. And we said, look, according to this, it's impossible. And normally people say, well, and they think about it, this person just said, I just know I can. Trust me, I just know I can. Of course, we didn't trust them. They didn't get the job. You can't be a great manager without being a bias interrupter, without asking people their bias questions, helping people to mitigate their bias, trying to mitigate your own bias. And again, it's one of my favorite topics. I do recommend Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman. I do recommend Doug Hubbard's books, How to Measure Anything, and several other books. Kelly, I think I'm done.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Okay, before we dive into the live Q&A session, I just want to let you know that we've dropped the link to the post-event survey into the chat, and a PDF version of today's deck will be available at the end of the survey, and you can look for that. Also, please submit all your questions using the Q&A button. We will not be using the raise the hand function. And with that, let's go ahead and open up the Q&A. So let's see. Okay, first question. What do you recommend for further reading on bias?
Well, definitely Thinking Fast and Slow. Definitely Doug Hubbard's You Can Measure Anything. I've got probably a half a dozen others, but those are the two I'd recommend to start with.
All right, thank you. Isn't there also bias in risk analysis and other analysis? And so does risk analysis really eliminate bias?
Yeah, it's a good point. Risk analysis can be biased as well. You looked at the least likely and most ranges. If those are biased, you're still going to be off. Hopefully not as far off as you would have been without it. But yes, it's a bias interrupter exercise, even to come up with the range, at least in the most as well.
And let's see, I have another question. How do you use SEER tools? How do they deal with bias?
Well, SEER tools have the least, the likely, and the most in most places, and do the risk analysis. So they can help you with bias. They also flag oftentimes, you sure? If the things don't look kosher. And so they'll sometimes turn red or yellow and just have you say, go check this, make sure you're not being biased.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. So if anyone has any other questions, you can type them into the Q&A. I just wanted to take another moment to thank everybody for attending, and to please check the chat and click on the exit survey link down there where you can provide feedback for today's session. You'll also have an opportunity to suggest topics for upcoming sessions. You'll be able to download today's presentation and also to enter to win the $100 Amazon gift card. Also, remember to check galarath.live, and there you can find information on the upcoming March webinar. You'll also be able to find the latest updates, also video and handouts from past sessions as well. Those are all posted on galarath.live. So we're going to keep the webinar window open for a few minutes so that you'll have a chance to click on the link and answer the survey questions. The link will also be emailed out to everybody, so if you miss it, you'll receive it in your email as well. So thank you again.
Kelly, yes. It looks like we have some questions coming in the Q&A.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Okay, so for software development, what is the best modeling approach to mitigate bias for project estimations?
That's a loaded question. I believe you should use a parametric model. Of course, I recommend SEER because we built the SEER model. But using a model, using something that won't just have your biases built into it, that will give you industry averages and allow you to compare your numbers compared to others is really essential. My friend Capers Jones says for any project over 1,000 function points, which isn't that large, you just can't do it without a parametric model.
Biases tend to be more prevalent when there is a lack of information. How can you interrupt bias in those situations?
Write down what it is you don't know. So even if it's a lack of information, just write it down. Keep track of all your ground rules, your assumptions, and then dig in and see what you can find.
Kelly, we also have some coming in the chat.
Yeah, I see that too. Okay, excellent. All right, next question. Uncertainty to AACE International includes estimating error, estimating bias, and inherent risk. That means that the estimate of uncertainty in 3-point ranges is the opportunity to correct the bias in the estimates. That's a comment, I think. Another question is, isn't it true that reference class forecasting and other calibration methods help eliminate bias in risk analysis?
They can, absolutely.
And some more questions coming in. Let's see. So how do you push back against bias in other people, especially leadership, when they question your cost inputs and assumptions?
Well, the way to push back is to have really reference classes, have actuals and comparisons to actuals. For example, in SEER, you can see what would happen with just the knowledge bases, which is their baseline estimate, compared to what your estimate is. It'll show you where things are turning yellow, depending on which model, turning yellow or red, saying, are you sure about this? And sometimes they've got an answer they want, and you're not going to change their minds. But make sure that you tell them what it is. I remember my friend Peter Korda, who's passed away a few years ago, used to tell a story about how he did an estimate, and I think it was in Germany somewhere, and he showed him the estimate. And he said, "Get out of here. We're going to do it for 20% less, or I don't remember, substantially less." So Peter said, "Well, I did my best to inform you." He sealed an envelope and he handed it to the program manager, and he said, "Here, open this at the end of the program." And the thing had gone, I forget the number, substantially over what they had forecasted manually, and it's exactly what Peter had forecasted with a model. Not sure that gets you popularity points, but it's a good story for later.
Can the heuristic technique be an option to mitigate cognitive bias?
Yeah, heuristics are great. Again, if people will believe them. It's all a matter of what will they believe. That's why the things I think Kahneman talks about most are things where you can actually quantify them.
Has bias always played the same role over the past 30 years, or is it just more visible now and more understandable now?
Well, that's a great question. People were probably more biased 30 years ago, because I think things like Kahneman's work and others have raised the awareness. But bias is built into all of us. It's a basic human capability. It's always going to be there. So if we're less biased now, it's only because we're more knowledgeable of the bias problem.
That makes sense. All right. I don't see any other new questions in the chat or the Q&A.
Did we get the one on software development?
Let me be sure we got this one. Isn't it true that reference class forecasting and other calibration methods help eliminate bias in risk analysis? Did I ask that?
I think we talked about.
We did that one. Okay.
Yes, they certainly can.
Yeah, we did the software one. Okay. Well, if anyone does have further questions, always you can email us and we'll be able to answer those for you. Yeah, I think we did. I think we've covered everything that came in through the chat and the Q&A. Okay. So again, then please be sure you check the chat for the survey and the links at the end that can lead you to and go to gallup.com or gallup.live, excuse me, to also find the presentation and to be able to give feedback, and you'll be able to access the video of this webinar as well within probably the next week. All right. So I will leave this up again for a few more minutes and make sure everyone has time to do those things. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Dan.